Hey guys, today we're going to look at how to integrate API Gateway and SES, which will allow us to send an email from our application, which could be a front-end application like a web page, a single-page application that could send an email, whether it's a contact form or any other event that triggers an email to the user. And this is a common use case in many applications, and there are many ways to do this with libraries and whatnot, and if you're using integration tools like Zapier. But if you're working within the AWS ecosystem, then I'm going to show you a simple way to integrate API Gateway and SES, and you don't have to write any Lambda function code on the back end. If you're not familiar with API Gateway or SES, I'll go over them briefly. Just so you have a starting point. So API Gateway is an AWS service that lets you create an endpoint, which is basically a URL that you can invoke from any application using a HTTP method like get or put or post, and you get a response back from that API that you can use in your application. And it lets you integrate with many of AWS's backend services like Lambda or DynamoDB, or in this case SES. And SES stands for Simple Email Service, and that lets you send emails from the backend from either your code, which could be a Lambda function that you would write in a programming language, SDK, or as we're going to do today, with a direct integration like API Gateway. Alright guys, so the first thing we want to do is go to the SES console so we can create or verify an email address that we can use with our integration. So go ahead and click on SES if you have it listed here, or just type in SES to go to the SES console. Go ahead and create an identity if you don't already have an email address that you've set up previously. And with verified identities, what it's asking you to do is to provide it either a domain or an email address that it can use as a verified sender. That could be the from address of the email that you're sending. So go ahead and click on email address here. You could use domain as well if you own the domain, and if you want to use any email address from your domain, such as admin at your domain or do not reply, something like that. But for this use case, we're just going to use a single email address. You can go ahead and type in your email address here and then click create identity. What that's going to do is send a verification email to you, and then you click on that, and that's going to verify that identity for you, and it's going to show that status as verified. And once that's done, you're all done with the SES console, and we now want to move on to the API Gateway console. So in API Gateway, let's go ahead and create a new API, and you want to choose REST API because that's the one that allows you to integrate with all the AWS services. Click build, and you want to choose REST and a new API, and let's go ahead and type in the name, send email demo, and then type in a description, send email using SES. And you can leave the endpoint as regional and go ahead and create an API. So this is where it brings you the integration builder, and that's where you add your resources and actions, and resources and methods. By default, you can add your methods directly at the root level, but I like to create resources that are named for the function that I'm trying to implement. So in this case, we can create a resource and call it, I don't know, send email. And this will essentially be the path in the URL. So your base URL that it generates, which is, random character string dash API execute.com, something like that, and then / send email. So the first path after the base URL is going to be this resource. And you can name it whatever you want, but you want to keep it related to the function that you're trying to implement. Click on API course, which will enable course so that it can be invoked from any browser web page. And then click on create resource, and by default it created this options method because you enable course. And what we want is to create the method that integrates with SES. So go ahead and create method, and here you want to choose post. And actually you can literally choose anything. You can actually say any, and what this is really defines the method that you're going to use in your application to invoke this API gateway endpoint, which is not as important. I shouldn't say it doesn't matter, but is not as important as the method that you're going to use to integrate API gateway to SES. But we want to be consistent with what the method that we're using, so we'll just use post here as well. And this is our integration builder. So what we want is to integrate with an AWS service, not with a Lambda function. So we click on AWS service, we choose the region minus US East 1, and then in AWS service you select SES or simple email service. And here you want to select post because that's the method that SES expects to get the request from. So here we definitely want to use post. Here we can choose anything, but we usually want to be consistent between this and this. Action name is send email. And where this comes from is the command or the action from the API reference for SES. So if you go to the SES documentation, API reference, and these are all the actions that you can specify that SES provides, that the SES API provides. What we're trying to do is send email. So this is the action that we need to specify exactly as it is here in your action. And what this will do is execute this API command from API gateway. And in order to do that, we need to provide API gateway with the permissions to access SES and be able to execute the send email command. So that's where the execution role comes in. So we need to provide an execution role ARN right here. So to do that, we go to IAM so we can set up the role. And we go and create a new role. And we want to choose API Gateway as the service we're assigning the role to. And click on API Gateway. By default, any role that you create for the first time has a default policy to push to CloudWatch logs, and the policy that you want to attach, you do that after you create the role. So if we give it a name, API Gateway send email role, allows API Gateway to push CloudWatch logs and send email with SES. All right, we go ahead and create the role. And now we're going to go and attach a policy. So to attach a policy, you can either use a pre-existing policy that you may have already created that is shared among other roles, or you can create an inline policy that is restricted to just this role, which is what I'm going to do. Let's go ahead and put in SES here because that's the service that we want to give permissions for. And then the send email command or the send email action is within the right category, so we choose that. And here it's asking us to specify an identity resource ARN for the send email command, and you can add an ARN to restrict access to just that specific identity or specific email that you set up in SES, or you can allow it to access or use any email in this account if you want to just leave it, give it a broad scope. If you want to use the restricted access, you go back to SES and use the ARN for the identity that you created. So for example, this one right here, you can use this and copy it back here and add it as an identity here, and that will restrict the send email command or send email action to just this specific identity that you created. I'm just going to say any in this account, but you can do whatever your company policy is or however restrictive you want to be. And I'm going to give it a policy name. Okay. And we click on create policy. And that I think we're done with IAM. So what we want to do is take this role, copy this right here, and paste it in the execution role right here. And now we're going to go ahead and save it. And that has created our integration request along with these other blocks. We're going to focus on the integration request because that's where we're going to set up the integration. So guys, what we've done so far is hooked up our API gateway to the SES service using the action send email and giving it permissions using this role. So at this point, what we could do is invoke this API after we deploy it and send a JSON body to this API. But it's not going to work because we need a way to pass that data to the SES service. And that's where we create a mapping template. So a mapping template is really a script that allows us to transform the incoming request body into a format that our service can accept. So in this case, SES expects the input body to be in a specific format, and what we want to do is convert the incoming format, which we want to send as a JSON, to the format that SES can understand. And the format that SES understands is the form URL encoded format. So if you've created forms using HTML, JavaScript, single page apps, you're probably familiar with it. When you send a post command, send form data to a backend, the format of that post data is the form URL encoded format, and that's what SES expects. So what we want to do is convert the JSON format that we're going to send the data in and apply the mapping template to transform it into the form post format, which will get forwarded to SES. So the first thing we want to do is create a mapping template. So this is the recommended option when there are no templates defined. Request body pass through, and what we're going to do is add a mapping template, and our incoming request body is going to be type JSON. So we pick application JSON here, and Now it's opened up this editor where we're going to add our mapping template. Alright guys, so I have created this mapping template already, but don't worry, we're gonna go through it line by line so we know what's going on here. So if you're familiar with post request, sending a form data via post request, this should be familiar, where you're sending each element of the form as a key value pair, although it's not JSON, but you're sending each key and value as a URL encoded string. So if you're not familiar with post request, I mean, you can read it up on the MDN website, where it says a post request is sent via HTML form, and in this case the content type is selected by putting the string in encoded type attribute of the form and the value of the input or button elements, and it's the basic format is a key value pair separated by ampersand and with an equal sign between key and value, and then the values are URL encoded. So that's exactly what's happening here. So this is your key and this is your value, and we're sending multiple keys to SES that are separated by these ampersand values. So what SES expects some minimum data that we send to the send email command. So those are the message body, the subject, the to address, and the source, which is the sending email. So that's what we're sending here. So the format is the message object. Inside the message object you have a body. Inside the body you have the type of body. Now this could be text or HTML. And if you specify HTML, you can actually send an entire HTML page inside this value here. And HTML.data is what the element is, and you can get that from the documentation on SES right here. So if you look at the message object, it's got body, and inside it's got HTML or text as the content, and then inside content you have data. So that's what we're specifying here. So message, body, HTML, and data. And then the value, we're saying util.url encode, so which means we want to URL encode the value that we are passing it, and this value we're getting it from the input path, and the input path is the JSON path that we'll be sending from the front-end application. So this object right here represents the key in the JSON object. So the $sign is the base element, if you will, of the JSON object, the JSON body as a whole, and within the JSON body we have the message property in which we're going to send the actual content of the email, and that this value we're going to obtain from the input JSON path. So that's why we're saying $input.path, and it reads that from the input JSON body, and then we're going to URL encode the whole thing and set that as the value for the object that SES expects. And we're just doing exactly that for each of those keys, which is the message subject. We're passing it in this variable called subject, and then the to address, which is the email we want to send it to, destination, to address, member 1, again that's from here. I think if you look at the destination object, destination, to address, member, and this is the index or the number of the email address that you want to send. So obviously you can send it to more than one email address. You just have to specify a different index number right here. So if you were to send the email to multiple email addresses, it would be member.2, member.3, and you can also specify CC address and BCC address as well. We just have it to just the to address and just one to address. And then the last one is the source, which is our from email that we set up as a verified sender in SES, and we're just passing that as a string value, which is a constant hard-coded value right here. And once you have that, we're going to click on save, and that just saves it. And in order to test this, now before we test this, there's one more thing we need to do. So we're sending this request from API Gateway to SES, right? So the input body is of type JSON, but the content type that we're sending to SES is URL form encoded. So we need to specify that in the header that we're sending to SES. So here we go and put in content type, and here this is where we're going to type in application slash not JSON but application x www form URL encoded. So this tells SES that the content that we're sending it is of this format or is this content type. And whenever you specify this mapped from value as a hard-coded string, it has to be in single quotes here, so don't forget that. And we go ahead and click on create. For some reason I gotta click that twice, I don't know why. And if you're wondering where I got these functions right here, you can look up the API Gateway documentation where they list all the variables and the functions that you can use in your mapping templates. So here are the input variables and the util variables. Essentially, it's sort of like a scripting language. In fact, I think it is a scripting language called VTL that they use. Although what we're doing exactly is not the script, but you can write complex scripts using VTL in the mapping template. But what we're using is just this function right here, URL encode, which just converts the string to the form URL encoded format that we need to send to SES. So once we've done that, what we can do is test the API using the test utility that API Gateway provides, and that's where I think we'll understand better where these input paths come from. So let's go ahead and go to the test area, and this is the request body that we'll be sending to this API Gateway. So from your web page or single page application, you're going to send a post request to API Gateway endpoint and send this request body. So what's this request body going to be? So this request body is going to be a JSON object, and the keys of the JSON object must correspond exactly with what you defined here in the mapping template. So we defined the keys or the elements of the JSON as message, subject, to address, and the sender, obviously we've hard-coded it, but if you wanted to use a variable or send the value of the from email also in the JSON body, you could do that, but we're only sending in the message, the subject, and the to address, so that's what we need to pass in the JSON body. So we're going to create the JSON body right here, and we're going to add each of the key value pairs that we had defined in the mapping template. So starting with message, or you could specify any order, it doesn't have to be the same order. So we'll put in a message as this is a test email from API Gateway, Then we have a subject, testing SES email, and then we put in a to address. I'll paste my address here. So we have message, subject, and to address, and these correspond to the elements that were defined in the mapping template. So if you remember, in the mapping template we were reading the value as $input.path, and then we were saying $.message. So what it really means is this is the input that we're providing to the API gateway, and it's using this path, and it's traversing the JSON object, and this whole JSON object being obviously the $, and then it's using this value right here for this key and assigning that to the form variable that we're passing to SES. So let's go ahead and test this. And there we go. We got a 200 response, and SES responded with the metadata and the message ID. So it was successful. And that means if we go to the email, there it is. We have a successful sending of email from API Gateway. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to deploy our API so we can execute that or invoke that from an external resource, and we can try to invoke that from Postman before we integrate it into our web page or front-end application. So let's go ahead and deploy the API. And by the way, if you're not familiar with these blocks right here, these are not really necessary for our little demo, but method request just allows you to specify any authorization that you want to add on to the API gateway. This could be authorizers that you define here. That could either be a Lambda authorizer or Cognito-based authorizer, or an IAM authorizer, or you can specify an API key. That's another way you can secure your API when you're invoking it from a front-end application, which is typically something that you should do. And then these are again just ways to map the incoming parameters from the incoming request to the integration request. So you can specify query string parameters that you're passing from your web page, and then map them in the integration request to specific variables that you can use either in your mapping template or in your path. So we're not going to be using that here. And then method response and integration response allows you to customize the response codes that you are expecting back from your service, the backend service. So you could specify, I want a 400 response or a 500 response right here, and these are all the possible responses that you can get from your backend. Otherwise, even if your backend returns a 404 or 400 or some error code, your API gateway, if it successfully invoked the backend, it's always going to return back a 200. So if you want the error code from your backend to be passed through to your front end, then you would have to define these status codes in the method response, and then define the integration response, where you specify what type of code pattern that you want to look for that's going to send that response back to your front end. So for example, you could say anything that starts with a 2 and then 2 other digits right here, just send me back 200. And you could do the same thing for the other 2, anything that starts with a 4 and then 2 other digits, send me back 400. So that way any error codes that are generated by your backend, in this case SES or any other service that you might want to integrate with, are passed back to the front end where you can handle the error as you want to. But anyway, I mean, we're not going to get into that right now. So what we want to do is deploy the API. Let's create a new stage, call it dev maybe, or test, and just leave that blank, and we're going to deploy the API. And this is the URL that it has generated, and so this is the URL we're going to use when calling this API from our application or web page using Fetch or Axios, whatever library you want to use. But first we're going to test this out in Postman. So let's go to Postman and let's see if we can send this request from Postman to that URL that we just created. So we define it as a post request, so we want to choose post, and then this is where we specify our resource. So this is the base URL that API Gateway has generated, and the resource that we had defined was send email. So that's what we want to get here, and then we want to specify the body as JSON. And we're going to again specify the JSON body. I can say subject is this is another test, and message testing from Postman, and we're going to add the email address, which was under, I believe, to address was the name of the key, and we're gonna just copy the email right here, and I think that should be it. We just click on send, see what happens, and there it is. We got a message ID back, a request ID with 200 status, so that was successful. So if we, and there it is. We successfully sent an email from Postman to API Gateway, passed through to SES, and we got the email in our mailbox. Alright guys, so the last thing that we need to do is to test it from our application, which could be a front-end page that could have a contact form or whatever your application is. So basically some values that you enter in the front end or the user enters in the front end, and there's a trigger which could be a button click or whatever your application needs are, and that's going to invoke the API gateway URL, which is going to send that information over to SES, and that's going to send the email to our inbox. So I've created this basic form. It's nothing special, it's just a basic HTML page with a little bit of JavaScript, and it's got some form fields in it, and all it does is invoke the fetch API with this exact same URL that we used in Postman, and I'm specifying method as post, and the JSON body is the same body that we used in the previous test. So we're supplying the subject, we're supplying the message, and we're supplying the to address, and I'm just passing in the values obtained from the form fields. So, and I got a listener attached to the submit button. So let's go ahead and test that, and this should work. So let's say we're gonna test at test.com, and hello from me. I'm just gonna hit send and see what happens, and there we go. We got a response back from SES, which is the message ID. So that means the API call was successful. And if we go to our email inbox, and there it is, we got an email from SES that was invoked through API Gateway that was triggered from our form right here. And if you do get any CORS errors, just make sure you go back to API Gateway and enable CORS on the API. Sometimes it gives you that error when you first try it, but if you've enabled the CORS in API Gateway and given it basically star as the origin where you can invoke the API from, then you shouldn't be getting any errors when you call the API. So I'm going to wrap it up here, guys. If you found this content useful, just give it a like, and if you didn't like the content, let me know why in the comments, and if you'd like to see more content like this, and I will see you in the next one.